Welcome to RotaRail Tech Series Episode 9. Today we're just doing a follow-up video to our injector phasing that we covered in Episode 8. And this is in response to a question that came from Jay Renix on Facebook. And so his question is, still on injector timing, how do you measure and tune an injector depending on its distance from the combustion chamber / housing? So what this has got to do with, and I'll just show you. So just back to our previous episode. So we looked at the port timing and what effect that had on injector phasing and showed you some calculations on that. And so if this here is the more or less ideal injection end time for this rear rotor, the question that Jay has is, depending on where our injector is located in the inlet tract, how much earlier do we have to fire this than what the calculation based on the port timing says for the fuel to get from the injector into the chamber in time, so through the inlet port. So obviously if your injector, because it takes time for the airflow to travel in there. Now obviously if your injector's closer, so if you had an injector mounted right here, it'd basically be 0 time because it's injecting directly into the chamber. But if you've got, like, say, a bully manifold, like one of their quad, 4-barrel manifolds with injectors are sitting up the top here somewhere, and you're running side ports, it might be 12 or 15 inches that the fuel has to travel before it actually gets into the housing. So how do you calculate that? And there's actually not a simple answer to that question, unsurprisingly, because it's a very complicated dynamic system basically. So it's going to depend on factors like injector pressure, what the spray pattern is, airflow, RPM, the design of the manifold, how consistent is the velocity through it, all that sort of stuff. But so basically there's two ways that you can solve this. The first is that you can use some very expensive software, like hundreds of thousands of dollars per license, to basically just mock up the design of your entire engine, or design your entire engine and calculate all this mathematically. And that's the kind of stuff they do in Formula One. So, that's obviously out of the budget of everybody else, except maybe OEMs and some of the other larger racing series. The other way to do it is that you can basically, estimate it, plug some numbers into your ECU, and then test it somehow and refine your estimate, and use an iterative process for doing that. The two ways to measure it is basically using a dyno. And so the theory there being that you're going to get the most torque when you're putting the right amount of fuel makes its way into the chamber and gets burnt, because it's going to produce the most cylinder pressure, or the most pressure in the chamber, and that will give you the most torque. So one way is use a dyno with a load cell on it and measure the MBT and tune for that on the injector phasing. And then go back and refine your fuel tables. The other way is that you can use your O2 sensor, or reading the spark plugs if you don't have an O2 sensor. And what you're looking for as a proxy, if you don't have the dyno, is you want to know when the mixture is essentially the richest, because the richest mixture will show on the plugs as when the most fuel is in the chamber, which is what we want. And in the exhaust, it'll generally show as the richest lambda, so the lowest lambda value that you get when you're moving the phase angle around, because the most fuel is basically getting burnt, and that's kind of the couple of ways that you can estimate it. Now, when it comes to coming up with an initial estimate for a starting point, you can just start at 0 and just plug your way through the table. The other way is you can kind of come up with a rough number. So like I said, if your injector's down here, you basically just start with whatever your calculation off the port timing says. But if you look over here at our manifold, and excuse the mess here, so here's our inlet manifold. And so basically this is the face that mounts on the housing. So it's about 6 inches along the center line to where the injectors are. So we know a rough distance of the injector to the inlet. So we've got 3 inches here, 6 inches there, gives us about 9 inches for the injector location. Now, if we can estimate the port velocity of the airflow going through, which carries the fuel mixture in because our injectors are a fair way away, then we can come up with based on the RPM, an approximate time before this point where we have to fire the injector for the fuel to get into the chamber at the right time. And I'll show you a spreadsheet now for doing that.
Okay, so here's our spreadsheet from last time. If you recall that the grey line is the overlap area, and to get the fuel in that we wanted and have some flexibility, we wanted the injection end time to be about 90 degrees, which is the end of this yellow bar here. And the red part of the bar was the dead zone. And so this orange part is basically where we want the fuel exiting the intake into the chamber. Now I've extended the spreadsheet and added some extra fields in. So now I can specify the intake into internal diameter, which in my case is about 1.875 inches. Just an estimate of the volumetric efficiency. As I said, it's just an approximation, so I'm not going to get super complicated with this spreadsheet. So I've just put in 105 as kind of an average. And I've also put in the distance that the injector is from the chamber, which is roughly 8 and 9 inches I'm using. And then based on that, it calculates the intake flow. So this is 41.91 cubic inches. Is at 105% volumetric efficiency, 654 cc rotor. It's 41.91 cubic inches per intake stroke. If the area of the port, based on the internal diameter, 2.76 inches squared, then the length of the charge in the intake at this diameter to make this volume is 15.18 inches. So now we know how much in terms of the length of the charge needs to flow through the port. We can use that to determine the airspeed, the velocity through the intake port based on the RPM. So as you see at idle, it's about 42 feet per second, all the way up to 11,000, this line here. It's about 230 feet per second. So obviously the faster the rotor is moving, the faster the air's got to move to equalize the pressure, because it's actually the atmospheric pressure, or in our case boost, but atmospheric pressure is what is pushing the air through the port into the chamber, because the rotors lower the pressure inside the chamber as during the intake stroke. So it expands, pressure drops, atmospheric pressure pushes air in. So based off this airspeed, what we can then say, well, how many milliseconds that based on this distance, 8 inches away, at this velocity, how long does it take? So at 231 feet per second, how long does it take to travel 8 inches? And that's 2.8 milliseconds for the primary, and for 9 inches, it's 3.2 milliseconds. And then we convert that back to an angle, which gives us about 190 degrees on the primary and 213 degrees on the secondary. So this angle, and this comes out to be a constant because you've got a velocity over a velocity, so you end up with basically a straight angle calculation out the end. And you can verify that, because if you look at here, I've also calculated exactly the same angle. This is basically this length divided by, so this 8 inches divided by 15 times 360 gives you 190 degrees. So it actually turns out it's a constant. But what you'll find is that due to all the dynamic effects that go on in the real world, it won't be a constant value across all RPMs. And it probably won't even be exactly this angle. This is just a starting point to plug into the tables, which then needs to be further refined, like I said, either on the dyno or using the OT sensor or reading the plugs if you're desperate. So that's basically gives you an idea of how it works. So basically what that means is that this isn't when we're actually going to be injecting the fuel through the injector. This orange bar is when we want the fuel going and exiting the port into the into the rotor, into the chamber. And so this needs to be done earlier by about 200 degrees roughly. So rather than starting injection here at about 237 degrees, we'd actually start at about 37 degrees. And by the time, by the time the fuel and the air travels through the intake, it'll be at this point. So Jay, I hope that answers your question. And if not, let me know, and I'll try and come up with a simpler explanation. But I think it should be pretty obvious. Thanks for watching.